The story of the commandments does not begin with stone, thunder, or fire, but with language. In the ancient world, to speak was to establish reality, and to receive spoken words from a deity was to enter a binding relationship that defined identity, land, memory, and future. What later generations would call commandments were first understood as divine utterances shaped by covenant traditions familiar across the ancient Near East, where kings bound subjects through solemn words rather than abstract legal codes. In the Hebrew tradition, the revelation at Sinai is described not primarily as a list of laws, but as 10 spoken declarations. The earliest biblical language does not call them commandments in the modern sense, but words. This distinction is subtle, yet decisive. Words imply relationship before regulation, meaning before enforcement. They functioned as the audible form of a covenant, comparable to treaty formulas known from Hittite and Mesopotamian sources, where a sovereign's speech established obligations, loyalty, and shared history. These covenantal words were never meant to exist in isolation. In the biblical narrative, they emerge within a wider framework of divine instruction, ritual direction, and communal expectation. Long before Sinai, figures like Abraham are portrayed as keeping statutes, commandments, and laws that are never itemized. This implies that divine instruction predated the famous 10, and that revelation unfolded gradually, shaped by context, crisis, and necessity. When the text later recalls the Sinai event, it does so with an economy that raises questions. The phrase 10 words suggests completeness and balance, a symbolic fullness rather than a comprehensive legal system. In Semitic thought, numbers often function as theological statements rather than arithmetic totals. 10 signals wholeness, order, and cosmic structure. It does not necessarily imply that only 10 divine instructions ever existed. Within the biblical text itself, there are signs of compression. Different passages present the so-called commandments in varying forms, with shifts in wording, emphasis, and sequence. Some traditions emphasize ethical prohibitions, others ritual obligations. The Sabbath command, for example, is grounded once in creation and elsewhere in liberation from slavery. These are not contradictions, but reflections of layered memory, preserved through oral transmission before being fixed in writing. The act of writing, however, is never neutral. In the ancient world, to inscribe was to choose. Oral tradition allowed flexibility, expansion, and adaptation. Writing demanded selection and omission. When sacred words moved from spoken revelation to inscribed text, something was inevitably shaped, refined, and reduced. This does not imply corruption, but intentional preservation of what was deemed essential for communal survival. The Hebrew scriptures themselves acknowledge loss and rupture. Moses breaks the first tablets, an act charged with symbolic weight. Divine words are shattered before they can be carried into the community. What is rewritten afterward is not described as identical in every respect, but as restored according to divine will. This moment introduces the possibility that revelation is not static, and that what is preserved is what the community is capable of bearing. Later, biblical books repeatedly refer to statutes, ordinances, and decrees whose content is not fully preserved. Prophetic texts accuse Israel of violating commands that are never explicitly listed, suggesting a shared understanding that exceeded the written record. The prophets speak as if both God and people once knew obligations that later generations could only sense as absence. This sense of absence is not presented as failure of memory alone, but as part of divine pedagogy. Certain instructions appear bound to specific moments in history tied to wilderness life, portable sanctuaries, or fragile political arrangements. As circumstances changed, some commands lost their function, while others became dangerous or divisive if preserved without context. Ancient Israel did not exist in isolation. Its legal and ritual traditions developed alongside those of neighboring cultures. Law codes from Mesopotamia reveal a pattern where foundational principles are announced publicly, while supplementary regulations circulate within priestly or administrative circles. Over time, only the core declarations survive as symbols of identity, while auxiliary rules fade, merge, or are absorbed into commentary. By the time the biblical canon took its recognizable shape, centuries of upheaval had intervened. Kingdoms fell, temples were destroyed, exile shattered continuity. In such conditions, preservation required restraint. What could be carried across generations was not the fullness of divine instruction, but its distilled heart. The words that survived were those capable of anchoring a people without land, king, or sanctuary. The 10 words thus stand as both presence and silence. They testify to a moment when divine speech entered history, yet they also hint at what was withheld, forgotten, or deliberately withdrawn. They are complete enough to endure, yet incomplete enough to provoke reflection. Their power lies not only in what they command, but in what they no longer say. What remains is a covenant shaped by memory and loss, by revelation and restraint. To understand the commandments fully is not merely to recite them, but to recognize that they emerge from a larger, more complex divine discourse. The silence surrounding them is not emptiness, but the echo of words once spoken, now entrusted to history. The biblical record preserves a striking tension between what is written and what is assumed. Laws appear in the text as if they belong to a much larger, invisible framework, one that both authors and audiences already understood. This becomes evident when narratives refer casually to divine requirements without explanation, suggesting that the written text functioned as a reminder rather than a complete archive of sacred instruction. In several passages, obedience is described in comprehensive terms that exceed any known list. Individuals are praised for keeping all the ways of God, all His statutes, or all His commands, even though the surviving text does not specify such an exhaustive body of law. This language implies an inherited knowledge that once circulated widely, transmitted through teaching, ritual, and communal memory, rather than through permanent inscription. Ancient Israelite religion relied heavily on oral transmission. Priests instructed the people verbally, elders passed down customs, and families preserved sacred knowledge through repetition and practice. Writing existed, but it was limited, expensive, and reserved for what needed to endure beyond living memory. Many divine instructions may never have been intended for permanent inscription, functioning instead as situational guidance tied to specific historical moments. The wilderness period offers a clear example of this dynamic. The biblical narrative portrays a community governed by immediate divine direction, responding to crises as they arose. Instructions regarding purity, camp order, leadership disputes, and ritual response to divine presence appear episodically, often without later reinforcement. Some of these commands vanish from the narrative once the conditions that required them no longer exist. This selective survival is especially evident in ritual law. Certain practices are described in detail at one point, then disappear without comment. Later texts assume different norms, sometimes even condemning earlier behaviors. This does not necessarily reflect theological contradiction, but historical evolution. What was once commanded under one set of circumstances could become forbidden or irrelevant under another. The land itself plays a crucial role in this process. Many divine instructions are explicitly tied to geography, sanctuary location, or political structure. When Israel lost control of its land and temple, commandments bound to those realities could no longer function as intended. In exile, preservation shifted toward ethical, identity-defining principles rather than location-dependent obligations. Biblical authors were aware of this shift. Texts composed after national catastrophe emphasize inner fidelity over ritual precision. Obedience becomes a matter of heart, memory, and loyalty rather than full legal compliance. This theological adaptation required reinterpretation, and reinterpretation inevitably involved omission. Some laws were not merely forgotten, but actively reframed. Practices once tolerated or commanded were later criticized as misunderstandings of divine intent. Prophets denounce sacrifices offered according to established ritual, not because ritual itself is false, but because its original purpose has been distorted. In this context, withdrawing certain commandments becomes a corrective act rather than a loss. The concept of divine withdrawal is not foreign to Scripture. God is repeatedly described as hiding his face, withholding speech, or allowing silence as a form of judgment or instruction. Applied to law, this suggests that not all divine words are meant to remain perpetually accessible. Some are withdrawn when they no longer serve life, justice, or covenantal faithfulness. Ancient Jewish tradition preserves traces of this awareness. Later, interpreters speak of laws given temporarily, reserved for a particular generation, or intended only for ideal conditions that no longer exist. These discussions do not mourn loss as failure, but recognize divine restraint as part of a larger plan. The commandments that remain visible in Scripture thus function as survivors of a longer history of revelation. They are not isolated fragments, but carefully retained anchors. Around them once clustered additional instructions, explanations, and ritual requirements that gradually faded as circumstances changed. What endures is not the full transcript of divine speech, but its recognizable core. The silence surrounding certain obligations does not diminish the authority of what remains. Instead, it reveals a tradition shaped by discernment, where preservation and withdrawal work together to sustain faith across generations marked by change, trauma, and renewal. The phrase, 10 words, carries a weight that extends beyond counting. In the ancient Semitic imagination, numbers were rarely neutral. They expressed order, harmony, and completeness rather than arithmetic limitation. 10 functioned as a symbolic threshold, the point at which something was understood as whole. To speak of 10 divine words was not necessarily to define their quantity, but to affirm their sufficiency as a foundation. This symbolic use of number is evident across the ancient Near East. Legal and ritual collections often opened with a small set of core declarations that represented the authority of the lawgiver. These were followed by layers of interpretation, application, and expansion that circulated in priestly, judicial, or royal contexts. The foundational words anchored identity, while the surrounding instructions adapted to time and circumstance. Within the Hebrew tradition, this pattern appears repeatedly. The covenant is summarized in brief formulas, yet lived out through a far more complex network of expectations. Blessings and curses are invoked for obedience or rebellion without fully restating the obligations involved. The community is expected to know what fidelity entails, even when the text remains silent on specifics. This silence becomes particularly significant when compared with other ancient law codes. Mesopotamian collections, such as those associated with royal authority, present themselves as comprehensive, yet they too omit vast areas of daily life. Scholars have long noted that these texts functioned as ideological statements rather than exhaustive legal manuals. Their purpose was to define values, not to regulate every action. The biblical commandments appear to operate in a similar way. They articulate essential boundaries of covenantal life, leaving much unsaid. What remains unwritten is not necessarily unimportant, but assumed, contextual, or entrusted to living tradition. In this light, the 10 words function less as a ceiling and more as a visible frame around a larger, unseen structure. Evidence of this larger structure surfaces in the way Scripture speaks about law. The text distinguishes between words spoken directly by God and additional instructions mediated through leaders. Some commands are portrayed as eternal, others as provisional. The language itself implies gradation, suggesting that not all divine instruction holds the same scope or duration. This distinction helps explain why certain commandments fade from explicit mention. Instructions tied to specific modes of worship, social organization, or historical crises lose relevance as conditions change. When the sanctuary moves, when kingship rises or falls, when exile reshapes identity, commands bound to those realities recede from communal consciousness. The process is not arbitrary. Biblical authors consistently portray God as responsive to human capacity. Revelation is adjusted, limited, or intensified according to circumstance. The people are not overwhelmed with the full weight of divine expectation at once. Instead, instruction unfolds in stages, and some stages are later sealed. The narrative of Sinai itself reflects this principle. The people recoil from direct divine speech and request mediation. What follows is a layered system of instruction filtered through human leadership. This moment establishes a precedent. Not all divine words are meant to be carried directly by the community. Some are entrusted to intermediaries, others withheld entirely. Later tradition reflects on this moment with caution. Jewish interpretation acknowledges that certain teachings were spoken but not preserved in writing. This was not seen as deficiency, but as protection. Written words endure beyond their context. Spoken words can remain bound to the moment they were given. The act of withdrawal, therefore, does not imply divine inconsistency. It reflects a theology in which revelation is dynamic, responsive, and merciful. Commands are not static artifacts, but living guidance. When guidance becomes harmful outside its context, it is restrained. What survives as the 10 words is thus a carefully preserved core, capable of traveling across centuries, cultures, and crises. Their endurance lies in their adaptability. They speak broadly enough to remain meaningful, yet specifically enough to shape behavior. The commandments that did not survive as explicit text may have been no less divine, but more fragile. Bound too closely to time, place, or ritual form, they were not suited to become permanent markers of identity, Their absence is not a gap in revelation, but a testament to discernment. The 10 words stand at the intersection of speech and silence. They reveal a covenant meant to endure, while hinting at a wider body of divine instruction that once surrounded them. To recognize this is not to diminish their authority, but to understand their role as the visible heart of a much larger, now partially hidden, tradition. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls transformed modern understanding of how fluid sacred law once was. Hidden in caves near the Judean desert, these texts preserve legal traditions that diverge in striking ways from the later standardized form of Scripture. They reveal a world in which covenantal instruction was not frozen, but actively interpreted, expanded, and reorganized by communities who believed themselves to be the true keepers of divine law. Among these writings are legal collections that rearrange known commandments, intensify certain prohibitions, and introduce obligations absent from the received biblical text. These are not casual innovations. They are presented with full theological authority, grounded in the belief that God had revealed deeper or more precise instruction to a faithful remnant. For these communities, the law preserved in the temple-centered tradition was incomplete. What is most revealing is not simply that new rules appear, but how confidently they are treated as ancient. The language used suggests inheritance rather than invention. Commandments are framed as restorations of forgotten truth, not creative additions. This implies an assumption that divine law once existed in a fuller form, portions of which had been obscured or suppressed over time. Some scrolls speak explicitly of hidden law. They describe statutes revealed only to the righteous, reserved for the last days, or sealed until a moment of divine intervention. In this worldview, withdrawal is intentional. God conceals instruction from a corrupt generation and entrusts it to those prepared to receive it. Silence, in this sense, is not absence, but delay. These ideas do not emerge in isolation. They reflect broader currents within Second Temple Judaism, where debates over authority, priesthood, and interpretation were intense. Competing groups claimed access to the true meaning of the covenant, often accusing others of having lost or distorted key commandments. The very existence of such disputes presupposes that the law was understood as something more expansive than any single written form. The temple itself stood at the center of these tensions. Many commandments were inseparable from its rituals, calendar, and personnel. When different groups disagreed over the legitimacy of the temple leadership, they also disagreed over which commandments remained valid. Some practices were intensified, others rejected entirely, based on competing claims about divine intent. The destruction of the temple brought these questions into sharper focus. With the central ritual space gone, commandments tied directly to sacrifice and sanctuary could no longer function. Communities were forced to decide whether such laws were suspended, transformed, or awaiting restoration. The silence of Scripture on many of these points became newly significant. Rabbinic tradition, emerging in the aftermath of catastrophe, approached this silence carefully. Rather than attempting to recover every lost command, it focused on preserving what could sustain communal life without a temple. This required discernment. Certain commandments were treated as eternally binding, others as dormant, remembered but inactive. This shift did not deny that additional commandments once existed. Instead, It reframed their absence as part of divine wisdom. God, it was believed, does not burden a displaced people with obligations they cannot fulfill. Withdrawal becomes an act of mercy, not erasure. The Dead Sea Scrolls thus stand as witnesses to a transitional moment. They preserve echoes of a fuller legal imagination, one that assumed more divine words than the canon ultimately retained. At the same time, they illustrate how fragile such fullness was, dependent on institutions, geography, and communal consensus. What survived into the enduring tradition was not the maximum expression of law, but its most resilient form, the commandments capable of guiding life without land, altar, or priesthood, were preserved. Others receded into memory, interpretation, or hope for restoration. The silence left by withdrawn commandments is therefore not accidental. It reflects historical rupture, theological choice, and pastoral necessity. The law that endured did so because it could travel with the people, stripped of what required a world that no longer existed. Beyond the boundaries of the biblical canon, ancient Jewish writings preserve memories of divine instruction that never became part of the Torah's final form. These texts do not present themselves as inventions, but as recoveries of forgotten revelation entrusted to figures who lived before Sinai or alongside its events. Their existence suggests that the idea of withdrawn or hidden commandments was already familiar within early religious imagination. Texts associated with patriarchal figures portray them as recipients of detailed divine guidance long before the giving of the law. They speak of statutes governing worship, family order, purity, and sacred time that are assumed rather than explained. This portrayal reinforces the belief that divine instruction did not begin at Sinai, and that the famous covenantal words represent a rearticulation rather than an origin. Some apocryphal traditions describe commandments explicitly given and later removed. These accounts often frame withdrawal as a response to human failure or changing conditions. Instructions meant to guide an ideal society are described as being sealed away when that society proves unable to uphold them. What remains is a reduced form of law, calibrated to human limitation. In these writings, revelation is not treated as a single event, but as a layered process. Divine speech unfolds across generations, with certain teachings reserved for the righteous or for a future age. The presence of hidden law is not seen as a problem to be solved, but as a feature of divine pedagogy. Knowledge is revealed in proportion to readiness. The theme of sealed instruction appears repeatedly. Some texts describe heavenly records containing commandments not accessible to ordinary people. These laws are portrayed as perfectly just, yet too demanding for a broken world. Their concealment is presented as an act of restraint rather than abandonment. What is striking is how these traditions align with the internal logic of Scripture. The biblical narrative itself acknowledges that not all divine knowledge is shared equally. Prophets receive visions others cannot bear. Mysteries are revealed selectively. Law, in this context, functions similarly. Its fullness exists, even if its expression is limited. These extra-biblical traditions also illuminate why certain commandments leave no trace in the canonical text. If some laws were intended for specific historical moments or ideal conditions, their disappearance would not require suppression or loss. They would simply expire when their purpose was fulfilled. The apocryphal imagination does not accuse later generations of corruption for lacking these commandments. Instead, it portrays absence as a sign of distance from an earlier, purer state of relationship with the divine. Loss is acknowledged, but it is framed as consequence rather than betrayal. This perspective reshapes how withdrawal is understood. The removal of commandments is not necessarily punitive. It can reflect divine accommodation to human fragility. Fewer words do not imply less care, but a different mode of guidance. Early interpreters appear to have lived comfortably with this tension. They accepted that the written law was not exhaustive, and that some divine expectations existed beyond what could be recorded or practiced. Faithfulness was measured not by possession of total knowledge, but by obedience to what had been entrusted. These traditions also help explain the reverence surrounding the commandments that remained. Their survival was not accidental. They were the words deemed capable of bearing the weight of history, exile, and transformation. Other commandments, however sacred, were too closely bound to a world that could not be sustained. The presence of apocryphal law thus reinforces the idea that the covenant was once articulated more fully than the surviving text suggests. What remains is a distilled inheritance, shaped by withdrawal as much as by revelation. The silence of Scripture, when read in this light, becomes meaningful. It points not to absence of divine speech, but to a history in which some words were spoken, fulfilled, and then returned to silence. The prophetic books introduce a new dimension to the question of withdrawn commandments. Again and again, prophets accuse Israel of violating divine statutes that are never fully named. The language they use assumes shared knowledge, as though both speaker and audience recognize obligations that no longer survive in explicit textual form. This rhetorical strategy only works if such obligations were once widely known. Prophetic rebuke often goes beyond the familiar commandments. The people are condemned not only for idolatry or injustice, but for abandoning ordinances, decrees, and laws associated with covenant faithfulness as a whole. These terms appear interchangeably, suggesting a broader legal and moral framework than the preserved core would suggest. The prophets speak into a moral memory larger than the written page. This memory is tied closely to ritual and presence. Several prophetic passages describe divine disgust, with the sacrifices performed correctly according to known procedure. The problem is not technical violation, but a deeper rupture between ritual action and divine intention. This implies that earlier commandments governing worship included dimensions no longer accessible, leaving later generations with forms detached from their original meaning. In some cases, prophets explicitly contrast former instruction with present silence. God is portrayed as having spoken persistently through servants, only to withdraw speech when it is no longer heeded. This withdrawal is not limited to prophecy. It extends to guidance, clarity, and instruction. Silence becomes a form of judgment, signaling a breakdown in covenantal communication. The notion that divine law can be obscured rather than erased appears in these texts. God does not deny having given instruction. Instead, the people are accused of forgetting, neglecting, or abandoning it. Forgetting, in the ancient worldview, is not merely psychological. It is cultural and generational. What is not practiced ceases to be remembered. Historical upheaval accelerates this process. As political and religious institutions collapse, the structures that once preserved detailed instruction disappear. Priestly lineages are broken, sanctuaries are destroyed, oral transmission fractures. In such conditions, only the most essential commandments survive intact. The prophets do not attempt to reconstruct what has been lost. Their role is not archival, but diagnostic. They identify the consequences of forgetting, rather than itemizing what was forgotten. This restraint is telling. It suggests that recovery of every command was neither possible nor necessary for renewal. Instead, prophetic tradition emphasizes return to foundational loyalty. The call is to justice, mercy, and faithfulness, qualities that transcend specific regulations. This shift does not abolish law, but it recenters it. What matters is not exhaustive compliance, but covenantal orientation. This recentering has implications for which commandments endure. Those that express enduring moral vision are preserved and amplified. Those bound tightly to historical form recede. Withdrawal thus becomes selective, guided by theological priority rather than loss of information. The prophetic voice also acknowledges human limitation. There is recognition that the people cannot bear the full weight of divine expectation as once revealed. In this sense, silence is protective. God restrains instruction to prevent further condemnation. Later interpretation would read these prophetic tensions as evidence of a living covenant, one that adapts without dissolving. The law remains authoritative, but its expression is refined. What is withdrawn is not truth, but burden. Through the prophets, the commandments become less a list and more a posture. Fidelity is measured by alignment with divine character rather than by recovery of every lost rule. This shift prepares the tradition for survival beyond temple, sacrifice, and nation. The prophetic witness thus confirms that some commandments once known no longer function within the preserved tradition. Their absence is acknowledged indirectly through accusation, silence, and reformulation. What remains is a law distilled by crisis, carrying forward what could still give life when much else had passed into memory. Later, Jewish interpretation approached the question of lost or withdrawn commandments with careful restraint. Rather than attempting to reconstruct every vanished obligation, interpreters focused on understanding why certain laws endured, while others fell silent. This approach reflects a deep awareness that divine instruction is not static, and that continuity sometimes requires limitation rather than expansion. Rabbinic literature preserves the idea that not all commandments are equally active in every age. Some are described as dependent on conditions that no longer exist, such as a functioning temple, a consecrated priesthood, or sovereignty in the land. These laws are not denied or rejected. They are remembered as dormant, awaiting a time when their fulfillment becomes possible again. This notion of dormancy is crucial. A commandment can be fully divine and yet temporarily inoperative. Its withdrawal from daily practice does not negate its origin. Instead, it reflects an understanding that obedience must be grounded in reality. Law divorced from possibility becomes cruelty, not righteousness. Rabbinic discussion often distinguishes between commandments that shape ethical behavior and those that regulate sacred space. Ethical commandments are treated as universally binding, capable of traveling with the people into exile. Ritual commandments, tied to place and presence by contrast, are treated with reverence but restraint. They are studied, remembered, and anticipated, but not enforced. This distinction reshapes how silence is interpreted. The absence of certain commandments from lived practice is not seen as forgetting God's will, but as honoring its limits. To enforce what cannot be fulfilled would misrepresent divine justice. Withdrawal thus becomes an act of fidelity rather than neglect. Some traditions go further, suggesting that certain commandments were intentionally given only for a time. These laws functioned as formative discipline during specific stages of Israel's development. Once their purpose was achieved, they were set aside. This idea frames divine law as educational, not merely regulatory. The language used to describe these withdrawn commandments is often cautious. They are spoken of indirectly, hinted at, rather than enumerated. This restraint suggests reverence for what is no longer accessible. Silence protects mystery from misuse. There is also an awareness that too much law can fracture community. After catastrophe and exile, unity depended on a shared core rather than exhaustive detail. By centering life around a reduced yet meaningful body of commandments, the tradition preserved coherence without denying the past. In this context, the 10 words take on renewed significance. They are not simply the earliest commandments, but the most portable. They require no altar, no territory, no hierarchy. They speak to conscience, memory, and relationship. Their endurance is a measure of their adaptability. What was withdrawn remains present in study and imagination. Entire discussions are devoted to commandments that cannot be practiced, not to enforce them, but to keep their memory alive. This practice acknowledges loss without attempting recovery. It accepts that some divine words belong to another world. The rabbinic approach thus transforms absence into discipline. Not everything spoken must be enacted. Not everything enacted must endure. Faithfulness is found in discerning what is asked now, not in recovering every word once spoken. Through this lens, withdrawal is not failure of transmission, but success of interpretation. The tradition survives precisely because it does not insist on total recall. It chooses continuity over completeness. The commandments that remain active do so because they can bear the weight of history. Those that fall silent are honored through memory, study, and hope. Together, they form a covenant shaped not only by what is commanded, but by what is wisely withheld. Early Christian writings emerge from within this Jewish landscape of remembered fullness and practiced restraint. They do not deny the authority of the commandments, yet they wrestle openly with the question of completeness. The tension between what endures and what has fallen silent becomes central to how covenant is understood in a changing world. These texts often speak of the law as holy, just, and good, while simultaneously acknowledging that not all of it remains operative. Certain commandments are treated as belonging to an earlier stage of divine instruction, appropriate for a particular historical condition. This framing does not accuse God of error, but emphasizes progression. Revelation is understood as purposeful movement, rather than static decree. Within this framework, some commandments are described as shadows of a fuller reality. They once structured sacred time, space, and identity, but were never intended to function as permanent ends in themselves. Their withdrawal is interpreted as fulfillment rather than cancellation. What they pointed toward is said to remain, even when the command itself no longer governs behavior. This perspective echoes earlier Jewish thought more than it departs from it. The idea that certain laws were temporary, pedagogical, or conditional already existed. What changes is the explanation. Withdrawal is no longer attributed primarily to exile or catastrophe, but to a transformation in covenantal relationship. Early Christian authors frequently appeal to the heart of the law rather than its total scope. They speak of commandments distilled into fundamental principles that summarize divine intent. This move does not erase complexity, but it acknowledges that not every divine instruction can or should persist unchanged across radically different historical realities. At the same time, these texts reveal awareness of commandments no longer present. Arguments unfold as if addressing obligations once taken for granted but now questioned. The intensity of debate suggests loss, not ignorance. Something known has become inaccessible, and interpretation rushes in to fill the gap. The language of fulfillment functions as a theological response to absence. Rather than attempting to recover withdrawn commandments, early Christian tradition reframes their silence as meaningful. What has been withdrawn has served its role. What remains is what can guide life across nations, cultures, and generations. This approach also reflects practical necessity. As the movement expanded beyond its original cultural setting, commandments tied to land, temple, and specific ritual identity could not be universally applied. Preservation required translation, not replication. The law had to be carried without the world that once sustained its full expression. Yet, even here, the past is not dismissed. Withdrawn commandments are treated with reverence, cited as witnesses to divine intention. Their silence is interpreted, not ignored. They remain part of sacred memory, shaping theology even when no longer shaping practice. The result is a law understood less as an exhaustive rulebook and more as a revealed trajectory. Divine instruction is seen as guiding humanity toward alignment with divine character, using commands appropriate to each stage. Withdrawal marks transition, not rejection. This interpretive move carries risk. Distillation can oversimplify, and silence can be misread as permission. Early debates reflect anxiety over how much can be set aside without losing fidelity. The very existence of such debates confirms that the law was perceived as larger than what remained visible. Part 8 thus reveals how withdrawn commandments continue to exert influence even in absence. They shape argument, define boundaries, and provoke reflection precisely because they are no longer directly accessible. Their silence becomes a space where meaning is contested. What survives is not the full articulation of divine law, but its enduring intention. The commandments that remain active are those capable of crossing historical thresholds. Those that fall silent do not disappear into nothingness. They remain as traces shaping how covenant is remembered, interpreted, and lived in a transformed world. Material evidence from archaeology introduces a final, often unsettling layer to the question of withdrawn commandments. Excavations across the southern Levant reveal cultic practices once widespread among Israelite communities that later biblical tradition condemns or ignores. These findings do not stand outside Scripture, but alongside it, exposing a lived religious reality more complex than the preserved textual ideal. Household shrines, ritual objects, and regional sanctuaries point to forms of worship that appear to have been normalized for generations. These practices were not fringe deviations. They existed within communities that identified themselves as devoted to the God of Israel. Their disappearance from later tradition suggests not sudden eradication, but gradual theological reorientation. Some of these practices may once have been regulated rather than forbidden, Archaeological patterns indicate continuity before condemnation. This implies that divine instruction regarding worship evolved, and that commandments governing sacred practice were revised, restricted, or withdrawn as religious understanding matured. What was once permitted under regulation later became unacceptable under new theological frameworks. The centralization of worship plays a critical role in this transformation. As religious authority consolidated, commandments tied to local sanctuaries lost legitimacy. Instructions that once governed decentralized worship could no longer function within a centralized system. Their disappearance from authoritative memory reflects institutional change rather than simple neglect. Archaeology also reveals silences that align with textual absence. Certain ritual behaviors vanish from material record, at the same time they vanish from written law. This convergence suggests deliberate withdrawal rather than accidental loss. Practice follows theology, and theology reshapes memory. These shifts are not portrayed in Scripture as historical footnotes, but as acts of divine will. Reform movements are framed as returns, not innovations. Earlier commands that no longer align with emerging theology are reinterpreted as misunderstandings or concessions. Withdrawal is retroactively sanctified. This process reveals how commandments function within history. They are not isolated absolutes, but expressions of divine intention shaped by human capacity, institutional structure, and moral development. Archaeology confirms what texts imply. Law is lived before it is written, and forgotten before it is denied. What emerges is a pattern of pruning. Practices once central are removed to preserve coherence and fidelity under new conditions. This pruning does not erase the past, but it reshapes the present. Withdrawn commandments leave material traces that testify to earlier stages of covenantal life. These traces challenge simplistic readings of biblical law. They show that divine instruction operated within real communities, adapting through tension, failure, and reform. Withdrawal becomes a tool of preservation, ensuring that what remains can still function as sacred guidance. By the time the biblical canon reaches its final form, much has already been left behind. Archaeology does not expose contradiction, but development. The law that survives is not the most expansive, but the most sustainable. The stones, altars, and objects buried in the earth stand as silent witnesses. They do not accuse Scripture of omission. They confirm that divine instruction once spoke in forms now withdrawn, and that survival sometimes requires forgetting what once guided life faithfully. These material silences prepare the ground for understanding the commandments that endure. They are not relics of a frozen past, but survivors of a long process of discernment. Their authority lies not in completeness, but in resilience. The 10 words endure not because they were the only commandments ever spoken, but because they could survive the long collapse of worlds. They remain when temples fall, when priesthoods fracture, when land is lost, and memory thins. Their preservation is not evidence of totality, but of selection shaped by history, theology, and mercy. Across Scripture, interpretation, and material record, a consistent pattern emerges. Divine instruction appears fuller at the moment of revelation and leaner in the moment of survival. What is withdrawn is not erased from divine knowledge, but released from human obligation. Silence becomes a boundary placed for the sake of life rather than a sign of abandonment. The idea that God withdrew words challenges modern assumptions about law as fixed and exhaustive. In the biblical imagination, law is relational. It is given to a people at a time for a purpose. When conditions change, guidance changes with them. Withdrawal does not negate holiness. It preserves it from distortion. This understanding reframes loss as intention. The commandments that fell silent did so because they could no longer guide without harm, confusion, or injustice. They belonged to worlds defined by wilderness encampments, sacrificial centers, or fragile political orders. Once those worlds vanished, the words that sustained them were entrusted back to silence. What remains is a distilled covenant, capable of crossing centuries and cultures. The 10 words speak not to ritual precision alone, but to allegiance, memory, restraint, and trust. They demand less information and more orientation. Their endurance lies in their capacity to shape conscience rather than regulate every act. The absence of withdrawn commandments is not a void to be filled. It is a reminder that revelation includes restraint. Divine wisdom is shown not only in what is spoken, but in what is withheld. The silence surrounding the law protects it from becoming a burden humanity cannot carry. This silence also preserves mystery. Not every divine expectation is meant to be recoverable. Some belong to moments now unreachable, known fully only to the one who spoke them. Faith, in this sense, is not possession of total knowledge, but fidelity to what has been entrusted. The 10 words stand as witnesses to this trust. They are not the final echo of a lost fullness, but the living core of a covenant refined by loss. Their authority is not diminished by what was withdrawn. It is sharpened. In the end, the question is not what commandments were lost, but why these endured. They endured because they could be lived without altar or empire, without archive or institution. They could be carried in memory, spoken in exile, and taught to children without stone or scroll. The covenant that survives is not the loudest expression of divine will, but the most patient. What God withdrew returns to silence. What God preserved continues to speak. And in that balance between word and silence, the shape of biblical faith is revealed.